Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. This week, we'll cover White Lotus Season 3 and Sara Duterte's impeachment.
We'll also talk about diplomatic visits in the Philippines and Indonesia. Today is February 20th, 2025. This week, Greg and Elina are joined by Henrietta Levin to discuss President Joe Biden's legacy in Southeast Asia. Before that, let's start with our headlines. Hey Lauren, did you watch any good TV this weekend?
I'm trying to figure out where this is going. I also don't know how much I want to reveal about my binge-watching habits to our audience.
Okay, fair. Let me give you a clue. It does actually have something to do with Southeast Asia.
Oh, White Lotus Season 3 is out, and it's set in Thailand. I was seated for the premiere, yes.
So, the popular HBO series has returned for a third season. It takes place in the tropical resort island of Koh Samui, off the coast of Thailand, about halfway between Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur.
Over the last 2 seasons, we've actually seen what's being called the White Lotus effect, where the show contributes to a boom in tourism wherever the season's set. After the first season was set in Maui, the island saw a 10-fold increase in hotel bookings. Season 2, set in Sicily, saw a similar pattern, with a 424% spike in flights and accommodation bookings to the Italian city.
So White Lotus is likely going to be huge for tourism in Thailand. COVID-19 hit the Thai economy hard due to its high dependence on tourism. But now that's beginning to turn around. A 2023 World Bank report on economic growth in the country estimates that tourism will return to pre-pandemic levels by mid-2025, and that's without White Lotus-inspired tourists.
So hopefully the show will take Thailand's tourism industry beyond pre-pandemic levels, which is really exciting for economic growth in Southeast Asia. Beyond just attracting tourists to the country, production of the show alone has given the Thai economy a major boost. HBO reported that on-location shooting of Season 3 contributed a collective $36.9 million to the economies of Koh Samui, Phuket, and Bangkok.
Social media feeds have been full of articles about places to visit in Thailand since the show came out, hopefully driving more and more people to see what the beautiful country has to offer. The freezing temperatures in DC this week certainly make me wish I was on a beach in Koh Samui.
Me too. Switching from TV drama to political drama, there's been an update in the impeachment saga involving Philippines Vice President Sara Duterte, who's the daughter of former President Rodrigo Duterte. You might recall that in November of last year, she made comments suggesting that she had ordered someone to kill President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., his wife Liza Araneta, and House Speaker Martin Romualdez.
That's a pretty severe statement for someone in high office to make. This isn't the first time Sara Duterte has been in trouble. She was already dealing with a series of scandals, including the mishandling of confidential funds. In December 2024, 3 impeachment complaints were made against Duterte relating to corruption, bribery, and betrayal of public trust.
A 4th impeachment complaint was filed on February 5th this year by 215 members of the Philippines House of Representatives on charges including corruption, plotting to assassinate President Marcos, involvement in extrajudicial killings, and an incitement to insurrection. The petition asks the Senate to remove Duterte from office and ban her from holding public office for life. The complaint exceeded the 102 signatures required in the Constitution, making her the first vice president of the Philippines to be impeached. Among the signatories of the impeachment complaint were President Marcos' son, Sandro Marcos, and House Speaker Martin Romualdez, who is the president's cousin.
That's right. For now, Duterte continues to hold her position while the Philippine Senate undertakes an impeachment trial to decide whether to officially remove her from office. The Senate received the House of Representatives' complaint on February 5th, which was also the last day of the Senate session. The Senate will reconvene in June, and the impeachment trial should begin shortly thereafter.
This is a developing story with the potential to spark mass unrest. In 2001, the impeachment trial of then-President Joseph Estrada on bribery allegations caused large protests and forced the president to step down. We will continue to bring you updates on what's happening with Sara Duterte as things progress. In other Philippines news, President Marcos was paid a visit by Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet.
During the visit, the Cambodian Chamber of Commerce signed a memorandum of understanding with the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, effectively bringing the Cambodian and Philippine private sectors a little closer.
Right, and the MOU highlighted increasing both trade and investment, while also improving cooperation and strengthening relations between the two countries.
This improvement in relations comes against the background of decreased trade figures from the last year. During the first 11 months of 2024, bilateral trade between Cambodia and the Philippines amounted to $79 million. Compared to the same period in 2023, that's a 1.82% decrease.
This also aims to make trade flow more equal in both directions, as exports from Cambodia to the Philippines decreased and exports from the Philippines to Cambodia increased over 2024.
Aside from the MOU, but also during the meeting between PM Manet and President Marcos, Sonaro, the Cambodian delegate minister in charge of ASEAN affairs, announced that direct flights between the Philippines and Cambodia would increase, as to make movement for business and trade flow easier.
Sounds like a productive meeting for Cambodia and the Philippines as they aim to improve their bilateral ties.
And just a bit farther south in Indonesia, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan visited Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto at the presidential palace in Bogor, West Java, and he was welcomed with a marching band, national anthems, and flag waving by crowds of people.
What an exciting welcome! The grandeur of the welcome was matched with equally important diplomatic work, and together the two signed 13 agreements on trade, energy, higher education, media, religious affairs, and more.
In a joint statement, Erdogan and Prabowo reaffirmed their goal of reaching a bilateral trade volume target of $10 billion. To reach this goal, there was continued discussion about accelerating a free trade agreement between the countries called the Turkey-Indonesia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which hopes to be in its first stage by 2026.
Beyond trade, Prabowo and Erdogan also discussed defense cooperation. Before signing anything, both leaders attended the first high-level Strategic Cooperation Council of its kind, laying the foundation for closer military ties. After that introductory event, Turkish Baykar and Indonesia's Republic Corp, both significant defense companies in their respective countries, signed a joint production agreement for the export of Bayraktar TB3 and Bayraktar Akinja drones.
These drones will allow Indonesia to improve its ability to conduct surveillance, reconnaissance, and precision strikes, effectively helping to modernize the military while also bringing Indonesia and Turkey closer.
In addition to defense agreements, the two countries also signed a memorandum of understanding on energy and natural resources, which was signed between Turkish Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources and the Indonesian Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources.
The MOU focused on developing cooperation on all things energy and mining, highlighting oil, natural gas, and renewable energy in particular. Indonesia's goal for energy self-sufficiency was also highlighted, the success of which was stressed to be reliant on partnerships of allies like Turkey.
Given all these avenues of bilateral relations, it sounds like Prabowo and Erdogan really like each other.
Yeah, they really do. This trip was part of Erdogan's tour of key allies in the Islamic world, but Prabowo was the only leader who explicitly called Erdogan his close friend and brother.
Last week it was Modi, this week it's Erdogan. Is Prabowo the next international bachelor?
Looks like it. Forget White Lotus. The Bachelor featuring Prabowo is what I really want to see.
Me too. And that wraps up our headlines for today. Did we miss anything that you wanted to hear about? If so, please write us at searadio@csis.org or DM us on your favorite social media platform. Up next, Greg and Elina's conversation with Henrietta Levin. Stay tuned.
Welcome back, folks. As always, I'm Greg Poling with CSIS, joined by Elina Knorr of the Carnegie Endowment. Hey, Elina.
Hey, Greg. This time I'm in person with you in the studio.
Just like you were 2 weeks ago, which we recorded 15 minutes ago.
Yes, exactly.
But now I'm pulling back the magic of the podcast studio. Yes, Elina has deigned to grace Washington, D.C. with her presence for the first time in, I don't know, how long has it been?
You're welcome. It's been ages.
Yeah, she decided that she wanted to see what Four Seasons was like again after all that time in L.A. where they only have the two.
Under a new U.S. administration.
9 days in for us. Something like 3.5 weeks in for those listening now. I'm not going to do the math. And today we are joined by Henrietta Levin. Henrietta just wrapped up a stint as the deputy coordinator for China in the State Department, aka the number 2 in China House, as the wonks around town call it. And before that was a senior advisor for Southeast Asia. Was it Southeast Asia and ASEAN? What was the official title?
Director for Southeast Asia.
I'm sorry, I said senior.
And thank you for having me.
and director for Southeast Asia at a time when there was like at times 3 directors for Southeast Asia, ASEAN.
That's true. When we were hosting the ASEAN leaders in DC, I think we peaked at around 3.5.
3.5 directors on the NSC for Southeast Asia. So by that introduction, I hope everybody understands that Henrietta is completely done with the stresses of 4 years in the administration. is now an international woman of leisure, but has been willing to come by because we wanted to talk about the legacy of the Biden administration in Southeast Asia one last time before we fully immerse the listeners in 4 years of Trump 2.0.
And embrace the new administration.
Some of the listeners will, and some of them will not. And our job is to just call balls and strikes, or so I'm told.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So, Henrietta, first off, I think for a lot of listeners, if they're not based in D.C., they've probably never spoken to you because, you were not Mira or Kurt who had to go out and like defend the policy, right? You were in the trenches for 4 years.
Just had to do it.
Actually doing the policy. What's it like now being in front of a microphone, having the freedom to speak your mind?
Well, so actually my first job in government a million years ago was at the Pentagon as a spokesperson, with a lot of microphones in my face a lot of the time, but less speaking my mind. So combining those two things is an interesting new experience. I'm very excited about it.
So you were speaking somebody else's mind.
Speaking the mind of the federal government.
Yeah. All right, so why don't I give you the real softball then? What's the legacy of the Biden administration in Southeast Asia?
Look, I would start by saying I actually, started working on Southeast Asia in the tail end of the Trump NSC and stayed through the transition. And I think you'll see a lot of continuity in recognition that our alliances and partnerships in Southeast Asia are absolutely critical to any successful U.S. strategy in Asia. But I think what we were able to do over the course of the Biden administration was to really supercharge those alliances and partnerships, looking at our relationship with ASEAN and the multilateral architecture, as well as in many of our key bilateral partnerships. So looking at ASEAN, for example, everyone comes in saying ASEAN centrality, very important, and it is. But we wanted to make that more concrete and more enduring than it had been in the past. So we launched 5 new ministerial dialogues with ASEAN. We've always had a ministerial with foreign affairs, defense, and trade. And we launched new, very high-level processes on energy, on transportation, on environment, on health, and on women's empowerment. And so that means you get, I think by the end, about half of the president's cabinet sitting down with ASEAN, having good conversations. But even more importantly, it means you have technical experts at the Department of Transportation talking to their ASEAN counterparts about how to deal with infrastructure challenges facing both of our communities, and really build out like a longer term infrastructure that's going to outlast any particular political level engagement, as much as those political engagements matter as well. So I think we did a lot of good work there. We also were very intentional about keeping ASEAN centrality at the absolute heart of our broader regional approach, even as we invested in a wide range of, regional platforms. So of course, we did a lot with the Quad. We developed a trilateral platform with the Philippines and Japan and the US, which is doing, I think, incredible work on economic security, on maritime issues. But all of it feeds back into ASEAN. And we were very intentional about bringing the Quad to ASEAN, to our Southeast Asian partners, explaining what we were doing, explaining how what we were doing supported intentionally ASEAN. And, of course, that can sometimes be a challenging conversation, but we always found it to be an important one that left us and the regional architecture in a stronger place. I would just spend a moment on our work in our bilateral alliances and partnerships as well. I think where there may have been the most attention was in our alliance with the Philippines, where...
Not for me. I barely talked about it.
Except for Greg. I am really proud of what we were able to achieve, not only in expanding the security relationship, establishing new sites under EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, expanding our cooperation in the South China Sea, but really building a comprehensive alliance that honestly we had never had before. Just investing massively in the economic relationship, in education, in health, in energy, and the energy transition, and building, honestly, just trust at a really deep level that I think will endure as well. And I think we brought that commitment and focus to all of our bilateral relationships in the region. Of course, we saw a lot of exciting movement with Vietnam, with Indonesia, even with some of our more complicated relationships, just a lot of focus from the very highest level in making those partnerships succeed. And then I also just want to say one thing on a very difficult issue that was always a top priority for the president and for us at the NSC, and that's dealing with the crisis in Myanmar and working to promote a return to the path of democracy there and dealing with the humanitarian fallout of the horrific repression that we have seen from the military there. And, this is something the president raised in every ASEAN meeting, every time, and really put a lot of focus on increasing pressure on the military, supporting the democracy movement, and addressing humanitarian needs of the people of Myanmar. And it's a really difficult issue. I certainly would not claim to know how it will ultimately conclude, if it ever would, but I am proud of the work we did to support the people of Myanmar at an incredibly difficult time.
So Greg threw you the softball. And
do we do hardball now?
Yeah, I was going to mix metaphors, actually. I was going to say, I'll play bad-ish cop. But I just want to push you a little bit on the institutionalization of some of these processes that you talked about. We've seen a lot of reversal that took place in the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. And you mentioned there was continuity, or at least some level of it, through from Trump 1 to the Biden administration. How many of these high-level processes do you think will endure the second Trump administration? You mentioned the Quad, for example, and how under the Biden administration, even Quad cooperation got brought back to ASEAN centrality. Well, the Quad ministers just issued a very brief statement, and it didn't mention ASEAN centrality. None of the previous language that we saw, which I think even in Southeast Asia, we took it as just, a nominal homage. But I think many in the region appreciated that that was even a mention. We've seen no mention of it so far. So how many of these processes, this institutionalization that you talked about, do you think will continue under this administration?
So caveating that I can't speak for the new team, I do think we've seen some positive indications. Of course, Secretary Rubio holding that Quad ministerial as one of his first acts in office, I think does speak well to his commitment to the region. But also he's gotten on the phone with a lot of his ASEAN counterparts and seems to have been having good initial exchanges, seems to have recognized the importance of building personal relationships with his counterparts in Southeast Asia as a matter of very urgent and early priority. But of course, I think that some of the other decisions coming out of the administration are going to complicate engagement in Southeast Asia tremendously. And I hope that there is an understanding of how kind of these broader dynamics do fit together, because these relationships are so important. And even on a very technical level, I mean, if you look at what the Department of Transportation or Energy or Health would want to achieve in its international engagement, it's very hard to get there without ASEAN. And so I think they'll find these structures that we built over the last 4 years to be quite useful, if not necessary.
So on the difference between engagement with the region through institutions, a la ASEAN, and engagement with the key partners and allies, I wonder, well, first, if you think that the way that I've often characterized this as kind of a tier one group that, as you indicate, a lot of attention on the Philippines, and then probably just below that, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore, and then everybody else. And Myanmar, of course, is unique. If you think that that is an accurate characterization of, the amount of time of office hours that went into managing those bilateral relationships versus ASEAN, if everybody who kind of wasn't one of those four, for the most part, got engaged with regionally. And that seems to be where the Trump administration is going as well. If I read, as you said, Secretary Rubio's first calls, right? It was Secretary Manalo, Secretary Buitanson, Secretary Sugiono. So Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia again. The exact three that got the most attention, at least in the public visits from.
Not in that order, though. So Indonesia first, then the Philippines, and then Vietnam.
I remember correctly. I believe Manalo got the first call. And then it might have been Sugiono.
I would just say on that, you never underestimate how hard scheduling is.
So let's not read too much into differences of a couple hours of the day.
Like the one time slot in a 2-week period that they could actually get on the phone.
Right. When I, I think back on 4 years of compliments and criticisms that I heard from counterparts in the region, I think for the most part, if you were from one of those four, except maybe Indonesia, especially in the first 18 months when they felt neglected, you were quite positive on the amount of engagement that you had from the Biden administration in South Asia. And if you were from Malaysia or Thailand, or certainly Cambodia, Laos, Brunei, maybe you felt that you weren't getting as much engagement, that there had actually been a significant decrease from where the Obama administration had been before that. Do you think that that's accurate, fair? And I would suspect that we're going to hear much the same lines from the partners under the Trump administration, unless there's suddenly a ton of engagement with Malaysia and Thailand, which I frankly don't expect.
So I wouldn't categorize things that way, and I don't think that's how we conceived of it in developing our strategy for engaging the region. I think that the relationship with our allies is always going to be kind of sacred in a certain way and will demand additional resources and engagement beyond what might be appropriate in the context of, very close partnerships. But I think that one of the central insights of the Indo-Pacific strategy is that every single partnership matters. There are no small relationships here. Everything matters. I mean, the amount of time that I and my very senior bosses spent talking to Ambassador Servini about, U.S. engagement with Brunei. Initially, in the first year of our administration, Brunei held the ASEAN chair. But even, in the absence of that regional conversation, I think there was always an understanding that we had to be bringing our absolute best to every single country in the region. Did we always succeed in that? And do you have to make hard decisions regarding resource trade-offs? Always. Though, of course, it was my job to try and do those resource trade-offs outside of Southeast Asia and keep bringing resources in. I mean, for example, thinking about one of our smaller partners, thinking about the Lao, it can be a challenging relationship, but one that I think both sides consider very important. And so you saw, for example, a significant increase in engagement in the Mekong and cross-regional programming, in part headlined by the vice president during her trip to Thailand. And, part of the goal there is to find opportunities to increase engagement with smaller partners where we don't have as strong a history, such as Laos, while also facilitating broader regional integration, again, under that ASEAN banner. So certainly the intent was to take each of these relationships with deadly seriousness, though, of course, we're always subject to some degree to the political will of our partners. And with President Marcos, for example, there was so much enthusiasm on his side and on ours for just doing everything we could to expand the relationship on everything from food security to the South China Sea. And we tried to really make the most of that kind of common purpose. But I think there was also a lot of that maybe just got a little less attention across the region as a whole.
And to be clear, I didn't mean to imply that was a critical question. I think my record is clear. I'm perfectly happy with certain Southeast Asian, not just the Philippines, but Southeast Asian governments with whom we have the most overlapping interests getting, a proportionate amount of attention. The president can't be everywhere at once. You're not going to spend as much time in Vientiane as you are in Manila or Jakarta. And that's, I think, criticisms otherwise that, you're not giving the region love equally.
Well, the president can't be everywhere, but someone from the American government can be. And so, part of my role at the NSC was kind of matchmaking across the interagency to think about which humans at what level in which agency made sense for which relationship. And so some of the time it's Secretary Raimondo leading a presidential trade and investment mission with very significant U.S. companies to Manila. And sometimes it's a desk officer who knows a lot about integrating energy grids across borders and getting that person out to a U.S. Mekong partnership meeting. And all of that matters, even though kind of the visibility of it differs a little bit depending on the situation.
I never guessed that you thought that way, Greg. But Henrietta, what was your perception during your time in government of how the region and different countries in the region received this enhanced effort to engage with every single partner on an equitable, if not equal basis?
So, of course, it varies, not just across countries, depending on who you ask. But, at the very beginning of the administration, we committed to the ASEAN Committee of Washington that we were going to meet with them. My boss, Kurt Campbell, was going to meet with them every week. And we were going to have an agenda. We were going to have outcomes. We were going to drive U.S.-ASEAN relations in a really ambitious way through this very aggressive pace of meetings. And everyone was really excited. And we did that for about a month. And then I think there was a sense that it was taking folks a lot of time to prepare for all these meetings, and they needed to catch up a little bit on the outcomes. And I took so much pride in that because I've never been told by ASEAN to show up less. And it was a big moment. And I think an early mark that we were going in the right direction in a way. But I mean, in a way, there's a broader point there that showing up needs to be the first step, but you have to deliver and think really concretely about what the U.S. is delivering for the region and how these partnerships really manifest on that level. I think, of course, where we didn't quite get to where we needed to be, certainly in the eyes of the region, was on the economic side. I do think that we had some really important economic initiatives that integrated many of our Southeast Asian partners, from the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, to even efforts to just mobilize private capital from the US at scale. So really scaling up what the Development Finance Corporation does in Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia, where they had some really large, important programs, thinking about how we can, for example, through the US Trade and Development Agency, do feasibility studies that open whole new markets to US players that wouldn't feel comfortable in the space without that prep work being done. And we could get that out of the way. But I take the point that, many of our partners wanted to see us get back into TPP, and that just wasn't going to be viable from Washington.
I'll ask a very impolite follow-up to that.
I will take it personally, just so you know now.
I understand. I'll deserve it. Administrations get remembered in kind of broad strokes, right? They don't get remembered for everything that goes into the White House fact sheet at the annual ASEAN meeting. They get remembered for these kind of big narratives. And I think it's already clear that the Biden administration narrative on the security front is going to be quite positive. They will be remembered as having reinvigorated the U.S.-Philippine alliance, U.S.-Japan, U.S.-Korea, building these new mini-laterals, whatever we're going to call them, and deepening a lot of partnerships as well, Vietnam being an obvious one, the CSP. And maybe the PGII will be remembered positively in like the Luzon Economic Corridor on a country-by-country basis. But I suspect the broad sweep narrative for the trade piece is already baked in, right? Whatever else happened, the line in the history book will be failed to rejoin CPTPP and failed to put in an alternative in terms of IPEF Pillar 1. How do you think about that? Were the expectations on IPEF Pillar 1 just unrealistic? How damaging do you think in hindsight it was that IPEF never really came together in the way it was expected to?
Well, so I guess I would start by saying that I wouldn't underestimate the value of the 3 IPEF pillars that were concluded and have been brought into force, looking at supply chain resilience, clean energy, and then tax and anti-corruption. But you're right that, that pillar 1, that trade pillar, was not concluded. And when I think about what we are missing as a result, what sticks out to me the most is the digital trade piece of those conversations. And so, we tried to fill in that gap in some different ways and thinking about how to invest in the innovation economy in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific generally, how we leveraged the capacity building assistance available to us under the CHIPS and Science Act for supporting the semiconductor ecosystem, for example, especially in Southeast Asia. We did a lot of this with Vietnam, for example. But I think it will be incumbent on future policymakers to come up with an answer, especially to that question of digital trade, that works domestically here, that works for our partners, and that can deliver concrete benefits to the American people and the people of the Indo-Pacific. I do hope that that sees some prioritization in the period ahead.
I'm sure one of the criticisms or concerns that you heard from the region was about the durability of U.S. policy, especially when administrations change. And I think that's another concern that's going to be at the forefront of many policymakers' minds in Southeast Asia with the Trump administration. Because I don't know how you feel, and I'd be interested to hear your views on how you think IPEF is going to play out under this administration. But Southeast Asia has seen the U.S. basically tear the TPP agreement apart with the change of administration. Is IPEF going to meet the same demise in not so uncertain terms? Basically, where is all your hard work going to go, do you think?
Well, look, so in our Indo-Pacific strategy, we said that the United States is an Indo-Pacific power. And that's not really a policy statement. It's more of an observation. I mean, the security and prosperity of the U.S. is so inextricably tied to this part of the world and to Southeast Asia specifically. And that's true even when you take China out of the picture, though that's often kind of the center of the conversation in D.C. But even we get, 25% of semiconductors for American industry from Malaysia. Like, these are really important connections on the commercial side, our people-to-people connections as well. And then, of course, there is the China piece. So I hope that the new administration will understand that succeeding not only in Southeast Asia, but really in so many things, in their broader economic goals, their broader security goals, will depend on being a strong and reliable and present partner for our friends in this part of the world. And I can't predict exactly how they will make those decisions, but that is what I hope to see.
I want to ask a really in the weeds process question, which I suspect most of our readership who tend to be policy nerds might,
we're
appreciate
process people here.
Right. More than the average podcast listener, let's say. We set up the very top. There was an unusual number of Southeast Asia hands on the NSC in the Biden administration. That was part of a very large, expanded Asia team in the NSC, right? Kurt, Mira, you had at least 2 at any one time on Southeast Asia, 1 on Pacific Islands, even more on the China side. Could you delve a little bit into what was the thinking from your perspective on the expanded both size and role of the NSC? What were the benefits and the weaknesses? And therefore, what would partners or watchers expect now that the Trump administration seems to be reeling that back and going back to a smaller, more consolidated NSC on the Asia side?
It's an interesting question. And there were, I think, 2 Southeast Asia directors, at least in the late stages of the first Trump administration as well. But of course, we grew even bigger than that, especially around summit season. I would say, especially on the ASEAN work, it was so valuable to have that capacity at the White House because so much of ASEAN is kind of interagency in nature. And I don't know how many hundreds of ASEAN meetings there are every week.
There's 3,000 ASEAN meetings a week. Little known fact.
I remember that number, yeah.
Need to fact check that, but probably true.
But, ASEAN isn't something that just exists in diplomatic channels. It's across every part of every government's cabinet. And we found we were much more successful and that the deliverables we were trying to offer to our partners were much more welcome and better tailored when we were able to have that really broad interagency conversation ourselves as well and have our full kind of economic toolkit in every conversation about strategic ASEAN issues. And I think that might have been more challenging if we didn't have so much focus out of the White House on how to do these relationships well. That said, I know there are varied views on this, and I might be slightly biased. But I think that probably the most important thing is to have strong Southeast Asia capacity across our full government. I mean, it can't just be at the White House. It also has to be at state and DOD and Treasury, but also transportation. The Department of Interior, for example, stepped up in a huge way to deliver really interesting conservation programming as part of the special summit in DC with ASEAN. So I think part of my job at the NSC ended up being to just do a bit of government matchmaking and making sure that we had really incredible people with a lot of expertise and empathy for and experience in the region, in jobs that might not have Southeast Asia in the title, but ended up being really critical to our success in the region.
I feel like we need to have some sort of a reality show or a Netflix show about Henrietta's speed dating matchmaker role at the NSC. We've brought that up a few times, but I wanted to ask you, I mean, you're obviously not new to the region or to the work that you were doing in the NSC. Was there any particularly surprising aspect of your work, despite your experience in and dealing with the region?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. There's so much of ASEAN culture that I feel I learned in that role, especially planning the summit here in DC, where you become responsible for the accumulated decades of very specific protocol expectations and culture and how to make the ASEAN way come alive down to, where bathrooms need to be located and all the way up to where President Jokowi wants to intervene in a meeting and where he expects to and where he always, I will say I probably was more surprised though, especially when I first started at the White House in learning more about our own government. And there are just such incredible people doing incredible things that I, as a fully institutionalized bureaucrat, knew nothing about. I mean, especially my first few weeks, I was probably learning at least once a day that a new part of the government existed and that they were doing something amazing and that I needed them to do it in Southeast Asia. For example, like I knew that NOAA existed, but I didn't know that it does like amazing atmospheric work with Southeast Asia, like working on climate change adaptation and other things, and that I wanted it to do more. I think that's probably what surprised me the most. Maybe one last thing, we spent so much time with the ASEAN Committee of Washington planning these many summits and, new opportunities for cooperation. And it was always such an incredible community. And I'm sure you've spent quite a good deal of time with the ACW as well. But such a special group of people. And we were very lucky to have them as partners here in DC.
Oh, I spoke like a true diplomat.
Right, absolutely. So Elina has come up with an idea for a very nerdy Washington reality show. This gives me an idea for a nerdy like Washington Challenger game show, like protocol-based game show. I give you the full name of a Bruneian second secretary, and you have to correctly fill out the name card.
I would watch that religiously. I might be the only person, but I am so in.
And luckily, you're between jobs right now, so if you want to, start producing,
I think this is a good idea.
I think that there is
I sense potential.
Is a small but dedicated fan base here in Washington. All right, we are going to have to leave it there. Henrietta, thank you so much for coming by to talk to us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Elina, thanks for making the trek to frigid Washington.
The things I do for this podcast.
Just for the podcast, no other reason. And thanks all of you for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the next episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at searadio@csis.org. We'll get back to you.
Do us a favor and subscribe and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform that you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer. Our hosts today were Greg Poling and Elina Noor. Our interns are Gemma King and Sophia Datta. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.